She rubbed her hand on his chest and her lips moved slowly from his chest to his pants. It all took 15 minutes, but after that she was sweating, brushed, took a shower, and put her nurse uniform back on. She took his vitals, left a prescription note on the table, and headed out. This had been happening for 3 weeks now, and the more Ada slept with Kola, the more she couldn't stop, even though this could end her marriage if her husband finds out. Ada was a nurse at the top of her game, having graduated with distinctions from the University of Lagos, UNILAG. How did we get here? The room was dimly lit, and the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional beep of the heart monitor. The young man lay in bed, his body weak from the illness that had plagued him for months. His name was Kola, and he was the only son of the wealthiest families in Lagos. His parents had gone to great lengths to keep his condition a secret, hiring private nurses to care for him in secluded mansion. They didn't want the world to know that their golden boy was sick. It would ruin their reputation. But for Nurse Ada, Kola's illness was an opportunity. She had been hired to care for him, and she took her job seriously, at least at first. Ada was a frustrated wife, married to a pastor who was always too busy with church events to pay attention to her. She had tried to initiate intimacy with him countless times, but he always rebuked her, telling her that her desires were carnal and unholy. He would quote scripture at her, telling her to focus on her spiritual life instead of her physical needs. Ada had grown tired of his excuses, tired of feeling unwanted and unloved. When she first saw Kola, she felt a pang of pity. He was so young, so vulnerable, but as she began to care for him, she noticed something that made her heart race. Kola was well endowed, more so than any man she had ever seen. At first, she tried to push the thought out of her mind, telling herself that it was wrong to think of a patient in that way. But the more time she spent with him, the harder it became to ignore her desires. One evening, after Kola had fallen asleep, Ada sat in the corner of her room, scrolling through her phone. She had been texting her best friend, Nneka, about her frustration with her husband. Nneka was always the one Ada turned to when she needed advice, and tonight was no different. "I don't know what to do," Ada typed. "I'm so tired of feeling like this. I just want to feel desired, you know." Nneka's response was quick. "Girl, you need to stop waiting for your husband to give you what you need. If he's not going to take care of you, you need to take care of yourself." Ada hesitated, her eyes flickering to Kola's sleeping form. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you're a grown woman, Ada. You have needs, and there's nothing wrong with that. If your husband won't satisfy you, find someone who will." Ada's heart raced as she read Nneka's words. She knew what her friend was implying, and the thought both excited and terrified her. She glanced at Kola again, her eyes lingering on his body. He was young, handsome, and completely at her mercy. The idea of taking advantage of him was wrong. She knew that, but the more she thought about it, the harder it was to resist. It started innocently enough. Ada was helping Kola bathe as she did every morning. She had done this countless times before, but today felt different. Her hands trembled as she washed his body, her eyes drawn to the part of him that had been haunting her thoughts. She tried to focus on her task, but the temptation was too strong. "Kola," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Do you ever think about, women?" Kola looked at her confused. "What do you mean?" Ada hesitated, then decided to take a risk. "I mean, do you ever think about being with someone intimately?" Kola's eyes widened, and for a moment, Ada thought she had gone too far. But then he nodded, a shy smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, sometimes, but I've never, been with anyone." Ada's heart raced. She knew this was wrong, but the thought of being his first was too tempting to resist. She leaned in closer, her voice low and seductive. "Would you like to? With me?" Kola's eyes widened even further, and for a moment he didn't say anything. Then slowly he nodded. Yes. Ada's breath caught in her throat. She knew she was crossing a line, but she didn't care. She had been starved for affection for so long, and now, finally, she had a chance to feel desired. She leaned in closer, her lips brushing against his. Then let me show you. What followed was a whirlwind of passion and desire. Ada took control, guiding Kola through his first experience. She was gentle at first, but as her own desires took over, she became more aggressive, more demanding. Kola was hesitant at first, but he quickly gave in to the pleasure, moaning softly as Ada took him to heights he had never experienced before. When it was over, Ada felt a surge of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by the satisfaction of finally feeling desired. She knew what she had done was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. After that first time, Ada couldn't stop thinking about Kola. She found herself looking forward to her shifts, eager to be alone with him again. She began to initiate intimacy more frequently, using her position as his nurse to take advantage of him. Kola, for his part, didn't resist. He was young and inexperienced, and Ada's attention made him feel special. But as the days turned into weeks, Ada's obsession grew. She began to neglect her duties, focusing more on her own desires than on Kola's health. She would sneak into his room at night, unable to resist the temptation. She told herself that no one would ever know, that she was just taking what she needed. But deep down, she knew she was playing a dangerous game. One evening, Ada met up with Nneka for drinks. She had been feeling conflicted about her actions, and she needed someone to talk to. As they sat at the bar, Ada poured her heart out to her friend. I don't know what's wrong with me, Ada said, her voice trembling. I can't stop thinking about him. It's like I'm obsessed. Nneka raised an eyebrow. You're still seeing him? Ada nodded, her face flushed with guilt. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. He's all I think about. Nneka leaned in closer, her voice low. Listen, Ada. You're a grown woman. You have needs, and there's nothing wrong with that. If your husband won't satisfy you, why shouldn't you find someone who will? Ada hesitated. But he's my patient. It's unethical. Nneka shrugged. So what? Nobody's going to find out. Just be careful and enjoy yourself. Life's too short to worry about what other people think. Ada knew Nneka was right, but the guilt still gnawed at her. She tried to push it aside, focusing instead on the pleasure she felt whenever she was with Kola. But as the days went on, she began to feel more and more reckless. One evening, Ada was in Kola's room, lost in the throes of passion when the door suddenly swung open. Ada froze, her head pounding as she turned to Kola's mother standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. What is going on here? Mrs. Adebayo demanded, her voice trembling with anger. Ada scrambled to cover herself, her mind racing. I can explain, she stammered, but Mrs. Adebayo wasn't listening. How dare you? Mrs. Adebayo shouted. You were supposed to care for my son, not this. Ada felt a surge of panic. She knew her career was over, but worse than that, she knew her marriage was over too. Her husband would never forgive her for this. Mrs. Adebayo stormed out of the room, leaving Ada and Kola in stern silence. Ada knew there was no coming back from this. Her life as she knew it was over. The fallout was swift and brutal. Mrs. Adebayo reported Ada to the nursing board, and her license was revoked. Her husband, upon hearing the news, filed for divorce, citing her infidelity and unprofessional behavior. Ada was left with nothing. No job, no marriage, and no reputation. Kola, for his part, was deeply shaken by the experience. He had trusted Ada, and her betrayal left him feeling used and violated. His parents, desperate to protect their reputation, sent him abroad to recover, far away from the scandal. As for Ada, she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She had allowed her desires to consume her, and in the end, it had cost her everything. She had learned the hard way that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how tempting they may be.